Hi, my name is Andrew. I was born and raised in a small Amish community in Pennsylvania, where simplicity wasn't just a way of life, it was everything. The world around me was quiet, orderly, and governed by rules that seemed both strict and sacred. We lived by the old order, a set of traditions that bound us to the land, to each other, and most importantly, to God. It was a life of humility, where obedience was the highest virtue and anything else was viewed with suspicion. My parents, like all the elders in our community, believed that to obey the rules, everything from how we dressed to how we worked and even how we worshiped, was the only way to ensure salvation. The thought of breaking even the smallest of these commandments was terrifying. I grew up with the idea that my actions, my discipline, and my devotion to these rules were what would guarantee me a place in heaven. To question those rules, to challenge that structure, was to risk everything I held dear. But deep inside, something gnawed at me. The certainty with which my parents, my community, and my church lived their lives felt comfortable, almost like a warm blanket I could wrap myself in. But every so often, a question would slip into my mind. Is this enough? Am I enough? If I follow all the rules, if I do everything I'm supposed to do, will that truly make me a better person? Or am I just going through the motions, checking off boxes without ever really understanding why? I tried to push those thoughts aside. After all, who was I to question the very way I was raised? The community I belonged to had been following these traditions for generations. Everyone around me, from the elders to the children, seemed so sure, so certain. In my world, doubt was not only uncomfortable, it was dangerous. But still, it lingered. I'd ask myself, was obedience truly the key to salvation? Or was there something deeper, something more meaningful that I was missing? Then came the accident that would change everything for me. It happened on a quiet afternoon when I was traveling to a neighboring town in our horse-drawn buggy. It was a familiar route, one I had taken countless times, and I had no reason to think anything would be different. But as I was crossing a small hill, a truck came barreling down the road. The driver was speeding, and I didn't have a chance. In the blink of an eye, the truck hit the side of our buggy, throwing me from the seat and leaving me dazed and disoriented. The next thing I knew, I was lying in the dirt, the sound of the truck's engine fading into the distance. That moment was like a door being slammed shut in my face. For a brief second, everything went black. And then, in the suffocating silence, something inside me began to break. I remember lying there in that dark void, my mind reeling, unsure of what had just happened. The pain in my body was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. What had I been doing with my life? What had all of that obedience meant? In the midst of the physical trauma, there was a deeper wound forming, one that hurt far more than anything I could feel on the outside. I realized I was suffocating, but not from the physical impact of the crash. I was suffocating from doubt. I had been living a life based on rules and rituals, on the idea that obedience would save me. But what if it wasn't enough? What if my entire existence had been based on the wrong things? And then that accident happened, an event that changed everything for me, causing me to start facing questions I had never admitted to. The darkness felt endless. It wasn't just the absence of light, but the crushing weight of all the unanswered questions, the doubts, the regrets, and the fears that had been building in my heart for so long. I had spent my life following the rules, thinking that if I could just obey enough, if I could just be good enough, I would find peace. But all I had found was emptiness, a void so deep that I didn't even know how to crawl out of it. I was alone, and the silence felt suffocating, as though I were trapped in a tomb of my own making. My heart was heavy with the burden of everything I had done, and all I could hear was the deafening echo of my own failure. I had tried for so long to rely on my own strength, on my own obedience, believing that my salvation depended on how well I followed the rules. But now, in the stillness of the moment, all those rules seemed so small, so insignificant. I felt like I had been clinging to a lifeline that had never really been a lifeline at all. I had been gripping a shadow, a false hope. It was in that moment, as I lay in the suffocating darkness, that the weight of my realization hit me like a cold wave. I had been so focused on doing everything right that I had missed the most important thing of all, the grace of God. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed help. I couldn't fix it on my own. So with the last shred of hope I had left, I cried out. I didn't know exactly what to say, but the words came out anyway. Soft, desperate, almost trembling. "Jesus," I whispered into the abyss. "Help me." And in that moment it felt as though the world stood still. And then something happened. At first it was just a tiny flicker, a faint glimmer in the distance, barely visible in the sea of blackness surrounding me. I could hardly believe my eyes. Was it real? Could it be? The light grew stronger, a gentle radiance that seemed to pierce the darkness, dispelling the oppressive weight that had been crushing me. It wasn't a harsh, blinding light, but a soft, warm glow, like the first rays of dawn after the longest night. The light didn't hurt my eyes. It filled me with a peace I hadn't known in years, a peace so deep, so tangible. It was as though it was wrapping itself around my heart, pulling me out of the suffocating void. The more I focused on the light, the brighter it became, and I felt my fear start to dissolve, like fog being lifted by the sun. It was as if every doubt, every regret, every dark thought I had ever carried within me was being washed away, leaving nothing but clarity and hope. The darkness began to shrink, retreating into the corners of my mind until only the light remained. I felt as though I were floating, weightless, as though the burdens I had been carrying for so long were no longer mine to bear. In that light, I found something I had been searching for my whole life, but had never truly known: peace. And then, as the light grew ever brighter, I saw him. I saw Jesus. He stood before me, not in judgment, but in love. His presence was calm, not harsh or demanding. He didn't come to condemn me for my doubts, my pride, my misguided understanding of faith. Instead, he looked at me with eyes full of compassion and understanding, as if he knew every battle I had fought, every time I had stumbled, and every time I had tried to do it on my own and failed. He didn't need to say a word to make me feel understood. His gaze spoke volumes. It was as if he knew the depth of my struggle, the depths of my heart, and he loved me anyway. There was no shame, no condemnation, just love. And in that love, I felt something stir inside of me, a longing, a deep longing to understand. Why had I lived my life the way I had? Why had I clung so tightly to the rules, to my own attempts at righteousness, instead of relying on the grace of God? Jesus didn't need to ask me those questions. He knew I already had the answer. But still, he spoke softly, with a gentle authority that I couldn't ignore. "Why did you rely on the rules, Andrew, instead of my grace?" he asked. His voice wasn't accusing, but it was filled with a deep, piercing love that made my heart ache with the weight of its truth. "Why did you believe that your obedience alone could save you, that your works could earn you what only I can give?" I couldn't answer him at first. The question hung in the air, and for a long moment I was speechless. I had been so consumed with doing everything right, so obsessed with following the rules, that I had missed the whole point of the faith I had been raised in. The rules were never meant to be an end in themselves. They were meant to lead me to God, to help me understand His love, His grace, but I had treated them as the goal, not the path. I had tried to earn salvation, thinking that my own efforts could somehow secure my place with God. And now, as I stood in the presence of His love, I saw just how misplaced my understanding had been. I had believed that obedience was the key, that the more perfectly I followed the rules, the more acceptable I would be to God. But in truth, it wasn't my obedience that mattered. It was my heart, my willingness to accept God's grace. The rules, the traditions, they were important, yes, but they were never meant to be the foundation of my faith. God's grace was, His love was, His sacrifice was. I felt the weight of my misunderstanding like a burden that had been lifted from my shoulders. I had spent so many years chasing after something that was never truly mine to chase, because salvation wasn't something I could earn. It was a gift, given freely, with love, without conditions. And I had spent so long trying to prove my worth, when all I had to do was accept the love that was already offered to me. Jesus looked at me, His eyes full of compassion, and I knew that He wasn't angry with me. He wasn't disappointed. He was simply inviting me to see the truth, to understand that my misguided reliance on rules had kept me from experiencing the fullness of his love. I had been trying to earn his favor when all along he had been offering it to me freely. All I had to do was let go of my pride, my fear, my need to control everything, and simply trust in his grace. And in that moment I did. I let go. I let go of the need to prove myself, of the weight of all the rules that had once seemed so important. I let go of the fear that I wasn't good enough, that I hadn't done enough. And as I did, I felt a sense of peace wash over me that was like nothing I had ever known. It wasn't the peace of doing everything right. It was the peace of knowing that I didn't have to. It was the peace of knowing that Jesus had already done it all for me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Not free from the rules, but free from the fear that had bound me, from the need to be perfect, from the shame that had weighed me down. I was free to simply be loved, free to accept that love without having to earn it. And as I stood there in the light of his love, I understood, truly understood, that this was the salvation I had been seeking all along. Not in my own efforts, not in my obedience, but in the grace of God. And in that grace, I found a peace that nothing in this world could ever take away. And as soon as I felt that light, an indescribable peace filled my heart. And I realized that everything I had ever believed could not compare to the grace that was being given to me. As I stood there, in the radiant presence of Jesus, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, one that I could hardly describe. It was as though I were standing on the edge of something vast, something so much greater than anything I had ever known. I had spent my life believing that salvation was something to be earned, something I could achieve by following the rules, by doing everything right. But now in that sacred moment, everything I had once believed felt so small. It wasn't about my efforts, my deeds, or my attempts at perfection. It wasn't about the endless striving to measure up. All of that, everything I had thought mattered so much, seemed so insignificant in the light of what I was experiencing now. I could feel his presence enveloping me, filling the space around me with warmth and peace. And in that moment, it became clear. Salvation wasn't something to be earned. It wasn't a reward for good behavior or strict obedience. It wasn't a checklist of rules to follow or a scale of how good I could be. No, salvation was a gift of love and grace that I could never have earned, nor would I ever need to. It was freely given to me simply because of who God is, not because of anything I could do. That realization was like a light flickering in the darkest part of my soul, pushing away the shadows of doubt, fear, and guilt that had long clouded my heart. In the presence of Jesus, I understood in a way I never had before that grace was everything. It wasn't about me trying to be perfect or measuring up to some impossible standard. It was about accepting the love that God had already extended to me. It was about trusting that he loved me, just as I was. I didn't need to prove my worth or justify myself anymore. I didn't need to follow the rules to earn his approval. His approval, his love, was already mine. And that truth, that simple, beautiful truth, filled me with a peace that I had never known before. I felt small, yes, but in the best possible way. I felt like I was standing in the presence of something far greater than myself, something infinite and all-encompassing. I realized that all the pressure I had put on myself, all the burdens of living up to expectations, my own, my family's, my community's, were gone. In their place was a sense of freedom, of relief, of overwhelming gratitude. I didn't have to strive anymore. All I had to do was accept God's grace, to receive the love that he was offering me. The weight I had been carrying for so long, the weight of my own self-doubt, my need to be perfect, to be good enough, was lifted in an instant. And in its place, there was peace, real peace. Peace that came from knowing I was loved not because of what I did, but simply because I was his. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood that salvation had nothing to do with earning it. It had everything to do with receiving it. And it was in that moment, as I began to realize the true value of salvation, that I heard the word of God ring out as a confirmation of the thoughts I was suddenly understanding. As I stood there, feeling the weight of his gaze upon me, something deep within me began to stir. Jesus spoke, his voice gentle yet full of love, and I felt every word cut straight to the core of my being. He acknowledged the sincere efforts I had made, the years I had spent trying so hard to honor God in everything I did. I had followed the rules to the letter, striving with all my might to be good enough, to prove my worthiness, thinking that my obedience alone would earn me His favor. I had believed that the more I followed the laws, the closer I would grow to God. But in His presence, I began to understand how misguided I had been. Jesus told me that while my intentions had been pure, I had been burdened by the weight of those rules. I had carried them like chains around my soul, believing that my efforts to follow them were the only way to honor God. What I hadn't realized, what I hadn't truly understood until now, was that the rules were never meant to be a burden. They were meant to point me to something far greater, a personal relationship with God. I had followed the rules, yes, but I had never taken the time to truly know God, to experience His love and grace for myself. I had focused on the external, on what I could do, and in doing so, I had missed the most important thing of all, knowing Him. As He spoke, I could feel the truth of His words sink deep into my heart. The chains that had once felt like a part of me began to loosen. I realized that I had been so caught up in the rules, so focused on trying to be perfect, that I had never truly walked in the freedom that God had always intended for me. And that's when Jesus offered me something I never expected, a second chance. He didn't condemn me for my misunderstanding. He didn't chastise me for my failure. Instead, He extended His grace to me, offering me the opportunity to walk in freedom. He invited me to let go of the burden of rules, to stop trying to prove my worth, and instead to simply walk with Him, side by side in a relationship built on trust and love. The freedom He spoke of wasn't about abandoning my faith or living in disobedience. It was about letting go of the need to control everything, to earn everything. It was about accepting that God's love was freely given, not earned. I didn't need to strive anymore. I didn't need to live in fear that I wasn't doing enough, that I wasn't good enough. I could simply walk with Him, knowing that His love was already mine. And in that freedom, I could finally experience the peace that had always eluded me. As He spoke these words, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was as if a door had been opened that I didn't even know existed. And through that door was a path to something far more beautiful and fulfilling than I had ever imagined. It was a path of freedom, of knowing God not just through rules, but through a relationship of love and grace. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood that salvation wasn't about following the rules perfectly. It was about walking with God, knowing Him, and accepting the love He freely offers. And yet, despite the freedom He offered me, I couldn't escape the weight of my past. The guilt and regret from years spent focusing on rules, judging others, and missing the heart of my faith still lingered within me, reminding me of the journey I had yet to complete. As I reflect on my past, I can't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow and regret. I spent so many years judging others, convinced that my strict adherence to the rules was the way to prove my faith, to show my devotion to God. I had this rigid idea in my mind that if I followed the rules, if I did everything exactly as I was taught, then I was better than those who didn't. I remember moments when I looked down on others for not living up to the same standards I had set for myself. In my eyes, they were flawed, their faith lacking, while I was somehow superior, more righteous. I believed that my obedience was a sign of my closeness to God, and anyone who didn't follow the same path was somehow less worthy. What I failed to see, what I refused to see at the time, was how my judgment and pride were actually pushing me further away from the very thing I sought, a relationship with God. The more I focused on the rules, the more I tried to perfect my actions, the more I lost sight of the true purpose of my faith. I thought that if I could just do everything right, then God would be pleased with me. But in the process, I completely missed the deeper calling, knowing God. I was so fixated on doing things the right way, so concerned with how others perceived my obedience, that I failed to realize that faith wasn't about following rules to the letter. It wasn't about looking good on the outside or showing others how well I could follow a set of laws. Faith, true faith, is about a personal relationship with God, one that grows from love, not obligation. I look back now and see how my actions hurt those around me. When I judged others, when I measured their worth by the standards I set for myself, I wounded them. I put up walls between myself and others, convinced that my way was the only way, the right way. I didn't give room for grace, for understanding, for compassion. I see now that the rules I was clinging to were never meant to separate me from others, but to guide me to God. I used them to elevate myself, to make myself feel superior, not realizing that in doing so, I was missing the heart of what faith is truly about. What a painful realization it is to understand that I spent so many years missing the point. The purpose of my faith wasn't to perform, to follow rules, or to earn a place in heaven. The purpose was to know God, to walk with Him, to experience His love, and to share that love with others. But in my pride and judgment, I had pushed that truth aside, allowing the rules to become my God, instead of the one they were meant to point to. Now, standing where I am, I see with clarity that true faith is not about what I can do for God, but about opening my heart to receive the love He has already given me. It's about knowing Him, not just following rules. And that understanding is something I wish I had realized long ago. And then, a transformative moment came as I stood there, listening to God's words, realizing that the path I had been following all along was completely wrong. As I stood there, listening to Jesus speak, a profound shift began to happen within me. His words were like a light cutting through the darkness that had surrounded my understanding of faith for so long. He gently explained that salvation wasn't about following rules or checking off a list of good deeds. It wasn't about striving to earn God's approval. That was the lie I had believed for so long. I had spent my entire life thinking that if I just followed the rules, if I could just do everything right, then I would be worthy of God's love. I thought that my salvation depended on my obedience, on how well I could live up to some impossible standard. But as Jesus spoke, it became clear that I had been going about it all wrong. He wasn't asking me to perform or to earn His love. What He was offering was so much more beautiful and freeing than anything I had ever imagined. He told me that salvation wasn't about what I could do for God, but about knowing Him. It was about building a relationship with Him, one that was grounded in love, not in duty. I didn't need to strive to prove myself worthy because I was already loved. I was already accepted. That was the message that Jesus was offering me. I didn't have to earn His love or His favor. It was already mine. All I had to do was stop trying to perform, stop trying to check off all the boxes, and live from a place of already being loved. It was a love that was unconditional, not based on my ability to live up to the rules, but simply because He loved me for who I was. For so long, I had believed that salvation was something I could achieve through my own efforts, something I had to work for, as if it were a prize to be won. But now, standing in His presence, I understood that salvation was a gift that was freely given. It wasn't about what I did or didn't do. It was about who I knew and the relationship I had with the one who loved me. It was about living in that love, allowing it to shape my heart and my actions. Not because I had to, but because I was already loved, already accepted, already chosen. The rules, the traditions, the rituals, they weren't the point. The point was knowing Him, walking with Him, and living from the place of His love. That realization was like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. I didn't have to carry the burden of perfection anymore. I didn't have to strive for approval. I could simply rest in the love of God, knowing that I didn't have to prove anything. I was enough, just as I was. And that truth, that beautiful truth, filled me with a peace and freedom I had never known before. Jesus had given me the key to real salvation, not through striving, not through earning, but through knowing Him and living from the place of already being loved. The call to share this newfound freedom weighed heavily on my heart, and though I hesitated, I knew that this message of grace and love was too important to keep to myself. As I stood there, still basking in the overwhelming love and grace that Jesus had shown me, something deep inside me stirred. I felt a fire ignite within my heart, a sense of purpose that I couldn't ignore. Jesus looked at me, His eyes full of compassion and understanding, and I knew in that moment that He wasn't just offering me freedom, He was calling me to share that freedom with others. He spoke to me softly but with such weight in His words, as though every syllable carried the responsibility of a mission I wasn't entirely prepared for. "Go," he said. "Go and share what you've learned. Teach those who are trapped in the same misconceptions you once had. Tell them that faith is not about rules, but about a relationship. Show them that they are already loved and that God's grace is freely given, not earned." At first I hesitated. The thought of going back to my community, to the people I had grown up with, my family, my friends, my neighbors, was daunting. How could I tell them everything I had learned? How could I possibly convey this new understanding, this profound truth, to a group of people who had spent their entire lives adhering to the same set of rules I had once believed were the key to salvation? I knew that for most of them, faith was synonymous with following the rules. Obedience was everything, and deviation from tradition was seen as a dangerous path. I had once been just like them, so sure that following the rules was the only way to be faithful, to earn God's love, to ensure salvation. How could I tell them that everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, was not the full truth? But Jesus' words rang in my ears, and I realized that I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't keep this truth to myself. How could I ignore the fact that I had been trapped in the same misconceptions for so long? How could I let others continue to live under the same burden of rules, the same striving, the same fear that had once held me captive? There were so many in my community who, like me, were striving, struggling, and burdened by the pressure to be perfect, to live up to impossible expectations. I had to go back, not just for myself, but for them, for all the people who were still trapped in the same cycle I had been in, believing that salvation could be earned through rules and rituals, that the path to God was something to be followed strictly, step by step, like a map with no room for deviation. I remember thinking about the faces of the people I knew, the ones who lived their lives exactly the way I had, who worked hard to follow the rules, to be obedient, to keep the traditions alive, believing that this was the only way to be close to God. I thought about my family, my parents, my siblings, and the weight of their expectations, how they had always raised me to believe that obedience was the key to everything. I loved them, and I didn't want to hurt them. But as I stood there facing Jesus, I knew what I had to do. The truth was bigger than any fear I had. It was bigger than the community's expectations, bigger than the weight of tradition. It was the truth that would set people free, just as it had set me free. "Lord," I said, my voice trembling but determined, "I will go. But what if they don't understand? What if they reject me? What if they don't want to hear what I have to say?" Jesus looked at me with kindness in his eyes, as if he understood the struggle that was taking place in my heart. "They will listen, Andrew," he said, "because the truth you carry isn't your own. It's my truth. And that truth will speak to their hearts, just as it has spoken to yours. You don't need to worry about convincing them. Just share what you know. Be open, be honest, and let my love flow through you. The rest is in my hands." And so, with his words ringing in my heart, I set out to return to the community I had once thought I would never leave, the community that had shaped me into the person I was before I had encountered Jesus. I knew the journey wouldn't be easy. I knew that many would resist, that the change I had experienced in my heart would be hard for others to grasp. But I also knew that I couldn't stay silent, not when so many were still caught in the trap I had once fallen into. I had to share the message that had set me free, that faith isn't about following rules. It's about knowing God, walking with him, and receiving his love freely. When I arrived back in the community, I was met with a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and even skepticism. The people who had known me for years were used to seeing me as someone who followed the rules, who worked hard, who upheld the traditions with unwavering dedication. Now I was standing before them, telling them that faith wasn't about all the rules and rituals. It was about a personal relationship with God, about experiencing his grace and love, about living from a place of already being loved, not striving to earn his approval. It wasn't easy to explain. There were many who couldn't understand what I was saying. They saw my newfound freedom as a threat to the order they had always known, a challenge to the way they had been taught to live their faith. But I couldn't be deterred. I shared with them my own story, the story of how I had lived for years trapped in the belief that my salvation depended on my actions, that my worth was based on my ability to follow the rules. I told them about the peace I had found when I realized that God's love wasn't something to be earned, but something that had already been given to me, freely and without condition. I shared how my life had been transformed when I finally understood that salvation wasn't about perfection. It was about relationship, about knowing God and walking with Him in love and grace. It took time, and there were many who didn't understand. But little by little, some began to listen. Some began to see that what I was sharing wasn't a threat to their faith. It was a deepening of it. It wasn't a rejection of tradition. It was a call to move beyond the surface and into the heart of what faith was really about. I could see in their eyes the flicker of understanding, the spark of curiosity, the beginning of a shift. And I knew in those moments that I was doing exactly what I was called to do. The truth, the love of God, was too powerful to be contained. I had been set free, and now it was my turn to share that freedom with others. It wasn't about forcing anyone to believe. It was about offering them the same gift of grace that I had received. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that the path I had walked, away from striving and into the loving embrace of God's grace, was the path that would lead others to true freedom. And so, I continued to speak, to share, to invite others to experience the same love and grace that had changed my life forever. And as I did, I saw the power of that truth begin to take root in their hearts, just as it had taken root in mine. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story and what I have learned in my journey of faith. If you feel this message touches your heart, I would love for you to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. Each like and subscribe not only helps us spread God's love and truth, but also gives more people the opportunity to receive the encouragement, motivation, and peace that only He can give. Also, I would love for you to leave a comment below this video. We are so excited to hear your stories and your sharing. Your comments are not only words of encouragement, but also an opportunity for us to pray together and support each other in our faith. Thank you for helping us build a strong community where God's love and blessings can spread to everyone. God has given us a priceless gift, His love and grace. And I believe that each of us can experience a change in our lives when we open ourselves to that love. Let God lead you as He led me, from a life filled with anxiety and fear to a life filled with peace and hope. Remember, faith is not about following a list of rules, but about a relationship with God where we are loved unconditionally and can live in true freedom. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this video and what you learned. I hope this sharing will be an inspiration for all of us, so that we can continue to follow the path God has shown us. Thank you again for watching, and I pray that God will bless each of you and help you feel His love and peace in your life. Let's walk together in God's grace and spread this message to more people. Top of form.